Hello, my name is Marco Cantù. Welcome to this webinar about using InterBase ToGo with Delphi XE2. We'll see how to embed the InterBase database into your Delphi applications, both for Windows and for the Mac, using Delphi XE2, creating BCL, and for the Mac, FireMonkey applications. My name is Marco Cantù. I'm the author of a number of Delphi books. I'm self-publishing Delphi handbooks, and I have a book in the works for FireMonkey. I'm also a conference speaker. I've given sessions throughout the world, a teacher and a consultant, and I partner with Kerry Jensen to bring Delphi Developer Days to the United States and to Europe. As I mentioned, I have an offering of Delphi books focused on the specific new versions, and there is also a handbook PDF covering the 4 handbooks on 2007, 2009, 2010, and XE for now. It's going to be updated in the future. Okay, that's enough for about myself. What are we going to cover in this webinar? There are actually quite a few topics, although the main idea will be to focus on using InterBase ToGo in Delphi applications written with both the dbExpress component set and the IBX, the InterBase Direct component set. And specifically, we're going to focus on deploying our applications on Windows and on the Mac. The starting point to consider is why we want to use an embedded database after all. Isn't that enough to have a client-server architecture and a remote DB? Well, at times it's not. It is nice to have local data on the end user machine, specifically when there might be a limited bandwidth to your database or security issues to have remote connections. So you should not consider an embedded DB as a replacement of a full database. It would actually coexist with a full database. But rather than using local files or other local caching technologies. For example, I often use the client dataset component, connect to a server, and then do a save to file to have the local cache of the data, so the user can actually work on its own data without having to connect to the server. And also by caching data, you can have multi-tier architectures in which you reduce the bandwidth by far. Let's say, for example, you have a salesperson and list prices don't change too much, but there is a very large table of list prices. Well, what you can do is every now and then, every beginning of the month, or when there is an update in the prices, you actually download the full database table, and then you store a local copy. And I often do this using local caching in terms of client dataset or other storage mechanism, but there is a distinctive advantage in having an embedded DB, which is a full-blown SQL server. When you're using client dataset, you can do a little bit of sophisticated operations, for example, creating a master detail within a single table. But with a full-blown SQL server, you can do full joins. You can have multiple tables and run sophisticated queries against the local cache, against the local data. So the idea of having a zero installation DB, which is as powerful as a full relational server on the end user machine with a very limited cost, and is actually quite interesting in many different scenarios, from standalone apps to caching scenarios to multi-tier caching scenarios, and even more. But of course, the standalone app is somehow the most obvious scenario. You have a standalone application which uses a full-blown SQL server requiring a very limited footprint and no installation and a very limited cost in case you pick InterBase. Why you might want to pick InterBase? Well, there are a number of reasons. Certainly, being a reliable database that's been around for many years, very stable, very solid. A lot of Delphi developers have used InterBase over the years. There is a great support and very nice integration from the Delphi IDE in terms of components, in terms of tool sets, in terms of third-party tools and controls, because it's been shipping with Delphi since day one. So that's been a very strong and continuous relationship between Delphi and InterBase over the years. Of course, there are other options, but this is a very good option. InterBase has, if you haven't looked to InterBase in recent years, InterBase has really improved significantly. There are advanced features like table level encryption, and also communication encryption, which we won't even mention here because it doesn't relate. There is the ability to target different servers, 32-bit, 64-bit. It takes advantage of multi-core data machines. So if you have a multi-core server or even a multi-core client, it can take advantage of those capabilities without asking you extra money, as some of the competing databases do. But one of the most significant features is the scalability. You can have a very small, database with an extremely limited footprint and no installation, like the ToGo version, and then with the same tools, the same code, the same tables, the same data structures, you can scale up to a full-blown and powerful server without having to change anything in your program logic, the application logic, the database logic. And that's quite interesting in terms of flexibility and scalability of your applications. Now, specifically, we want to focus on InterBase ToGo. This is really a zero installation database. You just deploy a DLL and some extra files with your application. Of course, you also need a license for the individual installation, but that's it. So there is no real installation to do but your application installation. There is really no configuration. There is a local configuration file you might want to tweak, but in most cases, you will just go with the defaults. It has an incredibly small footprint. Yes, you can install some major databases, even Oracle or DB2 on an individual end user machine, but this will kill most computers and make them stop working altogether because they are huge, both in terms of deployment and in terms of memory. That's also true for Microsoft SQL Server. Yes, there are lighter versions, but they're still far from small and far from zero installation. You have to deploy them to install libraries and other features, which are not as simple as in the InterBase ToGo scenario. Of course, there is no real administration needed, and that's true for InterBase and other databases. It's very simple to have it up and running and to have an efficient application that uses InterBase. For more information about InterBase in terms of installation, configuration, and a bunch of other features, I'd really recommend you to have a look to the InterBase Labs. This is the URL on the embarcadero.com website. There are a bunch of videos growing every month that show you how to work with InterBase in different areas of the product. Again, installation, configuration, Mac installation, and some more. It's mostly focused on the server, but some of the descriptions and some of the videos also apply, of course, to the InterBase ToGo version. As you probably know, there are different InterBase platforms. I kind of mentioned it. There's the full-blown InterBase server, which runs on multiple platforms, including Windows, Linux, Mac. There is InterBase ToGo, which runs on Windows and Mac. And again, it's a great match for Delphi XE2, given we can now create applications for both operating systems. And there is also, and that's relevant to notice, a developer edition which comes free with Delphi. So as registered users of Delphi, you can download and get a license to the developer edition of InterBase, which lets you do full development, not for deployment, but it's for full development. And as we'll see, it's also quite good to use it on the side of InterBase ToGo in terms of development, because it's slightly more difficult to develop directly against InterBase ToGo. It's often better to build your application against the developer edition of InterBase and then deploy on the InterBase ToGo version. The entire InterBase family shares administration and management tools. So you don't have different set of tools depending on the version of InterBase. You use the same tools for the server, for the developer edition, and also for the ToGo version. In fact, you can even use the same files of the same aligned version of InterBase and move them from the developer edition of InterBase to, and then deploy those files using InterBase ToGo in terms of database itself. So it's the same file on disk structure, the same physical files. You can move from one database model to the other. You can use your database files with the development tools, with the IDE, with the development version, and then deploy on the ToGo version. The InterBase ToGo is a complete database in a DLL, in a small DLL. Of course, it has limitations. It's local, so it has no remote connectivity. It just fetches information locally. It doesn't go through sockets, through TCP/IP, which makes it actually quite a fast tool because it hasn't got to go through socket. It just hooks to the data locally from your application to the DLL is loaded into your application space and reads the database file. It's single user and it's one application only, or one application at a time only. You cannot have two applications use the same file because, of course, you'll have two databases in memory competing for the same physical file. That would be a clear nonsense. So it's local engine, single user, one application at a time, which can use the database. There's also licensing limitations that let you run one instance at a time. So how do we get started with InterBase ToGo? Well, you can buy a license, or I'd really suggest you go for the trial version first. So what you have to do is to go to the InterBase site and get the trial and download the trial version of InterBase ToGo. You'll get a small download plus an email with a license key that's tied to your EDN account. You'll need that license key to register your local version of InterBase ToGo before you can actually use it. This is the download page for InterBase, and as you can see, there is the Mac OS version of the trial edition of InterBase ToGo, and there is the 32-bit and 64-bit versions of the trial edition of the Windows version. Of course, if you're creating a 32-bit applications, you need the 32-bit version. If you're creating a 64-bit application, you need the 64-bit version. You cannot match DLLs of different pointer sizes in a Windows executable. So either 32-bit or 64-bit, depending on the application you want to build. When you do this download, what we get is a zip file, which two internal zip files. One is the full version of InterBase ToGo, including documentation, samples, and more. And the second is the minimum version of InterBase ToGo, which is what you have to deploy to have a running application. There is the main EB2Go DLL, some extra configuration files, and again, it's 3 megs, so it's quite small. Plus, you need some support files for license management and license files, which of course are not, you have to configure by running the installation software after you unzip this or the other version of InterBase. Okay, so these are the two versions. You get InterBase ToGo, the full version, and the min, which is the reduced size version with only the InterBase folder and the licensing. Okay, that's what you have to deploy to your end users, basically. For the Mac, you get a similar download file with very similar content. Of course, you don't get DLLs, you get dynamic link libraries for the Mac. What you have to do after you download and decide where to install, but you'll later be able to move the license files within the same computer. You can run the license manager, add your serial number, and then do the online registration, which I've already done in this case. So we've downloaded the trial version, looked at the difference between the mini and the full installation, have a short look at the files and the license registration. Notice that this is how you work with individual licenses, but if you intend to deploy significant numbers of InterBase ToGo versions, you have to reach Embarcadero representative or sale manager and go for sign VAR, value added reseller agreement, and get VAR licenses. So you can not just buy in volume at a lower price, but also manage your licenses and the license registration to the end users in a much easier and straightforward way. The steps that you do with the trial are only the steps for the end user buying his own version, which is generally not the case. So now we have the database. We also get documentation in the full version of the InterBase ToGo package. You'll find a PDF file which is specific for the ToGo edition. Will tell you about differences between the full-blown and the ToGo edition and explain you a few specific features. For example, you might want to know where the messages are saved. The log messages, specifically when you have problems with configuration, installation, licensing, or so on, the messages are not saved by default into the same folder of InterBase ToGo, because the idea is you can use InterBase ToGo on a CD, on a DVD, on a CD, on a non-modifiable media. So the messages are actually saved in the user files, in the user document files. So that's one specific thing you might want to consider. And again, the documentation is quite specific, and I really recommend you to read that PDF. In terms of configuration and installation, the PDF also covers some of the development, but it won't really get you, it gives you some hints, but it won't really provide you a full-blown step-by-step information. How can we get started? We can use iSQL. The interactive SQL is actually part of InterBase ToGo. So you can use the command line and start fumbling with your database data or the sample database data, create new databases. But you can do the same operations again with the full-blown IB console that you get with the developer version of InterBase. You can create your databases separately, or you can just, as I'm going to do, start using the provided sample database, which is also part of the ToGo edition, and create a Delphi application against it. So here comes Delphi. We can, as I mentioned, build applications against the developer edition of InterBase that comes with the product, and then deploy for the ToGo version. Now, technically, you can also load the ToGo version of InterBase from the Delphi IDE, and you'll be able to build application against it, provided that the ToGo DLL is somewhere on the path, so it's visible to the IDE. The problem you'll bump into is that while the IDE loads the ToGo edition, even if you're not technically connected to the DB, you cannot run an application at the same time. So it's either you use the ToGo from the IDE or from running a debugging application. This is different from standard development, where even if you have one single connection, you can disconnect the database at design time from the connection component and then be allowed to run the single instance of your application. But we'll get to the demo in a second. There are two main alternatives in the box. There are other third-party alternatives, of course, but there are two main alternatives in the box. That's what I'm going to explore in this webinar. One is the use of the dbExpress InterBase driver that fully works against the full version of InterBase, but also against InterBase ToGo. And the other option is to use the IBX controls, the InterBase Express controls. In this case, there is a very specific configuration. There is a server type configuration that actually lets you quite easily build a Delphi application that works specifically with InterBase ToGo. So having said this, let's start Delphi. The first thing I'll do is I'll use dbExpress. I'll build a very simple VCL application and show you the steps for deploying the application with the ToGo edition. There are two ways. We'll follow both, but I'd certainly recommend using the easy way, which is renaming the InterBase ToGo DLL to what Delphi and dbExpress would actually expect. Okay, let's move to the Delphi IDE and let's create a new VCL forms application. And I'll go for dbExpress. And for this demo, to make things easier, I'll use the simple dataset. Although I generally tend to prefer using the SQL dataset combined with the T-client dataset, which are both and the provider, which are all embedded in this single component. We can create a user interface for our application by adding a data source hooked to the dataset and having a nice DB grid in the form and hook it to the data source. So that's going to be our UI for now. And then what we have to do is we have to configure our connection, which is the other component we need. Okay, so the dataset will use the connection, not the internal connection, but a full-blown SQL connection. And this is our connection. As I mentioned, we want to use InterBase in terms of driver. And by hooking the InterBase driver, we get a bunch of settings related with the application itself. By default, we get the standard settings to hook to the full-blown version of InterBase. In the SQL connection component, we just pick a standard InterBase connection, the InterBase driver, and the standard InterBase connection. And what we need to provide is a reference to the actual database file. Okay, but let's first see how we're going to deploy this application by saving it to a folder and looking at the resulting application folder structure. I've saved the project and the main form in a folder. And if we look into it in Explorer, these are our files. As soon as, if we're using the default settings in XE2, as soon as we build the application, what we get in the target is a Win32 debug folder with the executable. This is where we are going to deploy our database file and the DP ToGo and the InterBase ToGo DLL file. So let me fetch them. And now I've copied the files into the target folder. There is an InterBase folder with the licensing and some configuration files. There is the actual DLL of InterBase ToGo, the database, the sample database. And as I was into it, I also copied two other files that our executable will rely upon, the Midas DLL for the client dataset and the interface DLL for the dbExpress driver for InterBase. So this is all you'll have to deploy to the end user machine. Of course, what we have to do now is to make sure that our application loads the specific employee GDB file and uses the InterBase ToGo. So what happens as we run this application where I've replaced the database name with employee GDB without absolute path because we want to target the local file. And in the simple dataset, I've gone to the embedded dataset and use the select star from employee query in terms of query. What happens if we run this application? Well, this application works and we can open it. The open button simply opens the simple dataset, but in fact, we are not doing the right thing because we are doing the full-blown version of InterBase that's available on the local computer. If I now get to the services and stop InterBase, what happens in fact is that I run the application and not surprisingly, it says the database is not available because it tries to load GDS32DLL and tries to grab that information. Now, the simplest way to around this issue is simply to get a copy of the InterBase ToGo DLL and simply rename it GDS32DLL. And now our application, which is this executable, which binds the GDS32DLL, and we use the local version of the employee GDB. We don't even need to recompile. It will work locally. And again, the database server is, the InterBase database server is stopped, so it's not that one that's working, is the ToGo version that is providing us the information, the data to the dbExpress application. So that's quite straightforward. These are all the files you need. Again, you also need the licensing information and a few extra. There's a configuration file, the messages, but there's very little beyond the InterBase ToGo DLL file renamed to GDS32DLL. .dll. Now, the interesting thing about this model is that if I now re-enable the InterBase server, I can get back to my application and actually use the connection at design time if I provide the absolute path of the database or a different path for the database. And then what I can do, I can change the name of the database as I run the application. In other terms, what I can do is to grab the folder name, use it in the parameters for the database, and now I should be able to connect using the full-blown DB. And now, of course, I need to disconnect it before I run the application, but it's nice to be able to connect so we can see the data at design time. Now I disconnect everything, and before opening, what I have to do is to get the SQL connection, get the params, get the values, and for the database value, save employee GDB, the local version of the file. And these should work against using the local, the InterBase ToGo, and target the file with the relative path. Now, we have seen how we can deploy the ToGo edition in a very easy way, renaming the GDS, the InterBase ToGo DLL into GDS32 DLL and providing the license folder. But we might want to really go the official way and deploy the InterBase ToGo DLL as an alternative. Now, in theory, all you have to do is to get into the SQL connection configuration and replace the vendor library with the right version, which is eb2go.dll. Sounds easy, sounds straightforward, but the problem is that in recent versions of dbExpress, even if you set this property, this is going to be replaced by the standard configuration of the driver. So the driver configuration wins over some of the local settings like the vendor library, the driver function, and other. This is meant to simplify development, and it's not a bad idea at all, but it's actually quite complex to override. If you really want to follow that path, I do have a complete demo that does what you might want to do. The core idea is that since the vendor library is provided by the driver, we have to replace the driver configuration. There might be a simpler way. I've spent some time onto it, and I haven't found a simpler way to solve this problem. So let me open a different application. Here is another dbExpress application. This time I'm using the connection, the SQL dataset, select star from employee, the dataset provider hooked to the client data, so the SQL dataset, a client dataset hooked to the provider, and the usual data aware controls, plus I've hooked a DB monitor to the connection. Again, I could deploy it using the standard GDS32 DLL, even if I type here the vendor library, but there is a way around it, which is to create your own driver. So what you have to do is register a driver class and give it a name. We could do it in package we install, or we can do it dynamically, which is what I'm doing here for simplicity. And what we need to do is to provide a class, and this class will basically be identical to the InterBase class. This constructor has some standard settings and specifically uses a further class that provides the properties. So we have two classes to define, the ToGo properties and the ToGo driver. The ToGo driver just inherits from the base class, is identical to the InterBase one, but only it refers to the ToGo properties. The only modified code is the ToGo properties. The ToGo properties inherits from the InterBase properties, and the only difference is in providing the proper vendor library for Windows and Mac. Now what we want to do, again, to keep things simple, we cannot set the driver design time because this will raise an exception. What we can do, we can start the application, copy the existing parameters, because as soon as we change the driver name, we'll get everything reset, including the database name. Everything gets reset to the standard information for this driver. And then we copy back all of the various parameters. With this trick, even at runtime, the driver name information will be our driver name information, and the application will work properly using completely the ToGo configuration. Here in the target folder for this demo, I've uncommented the clone version GDS32DLL. So we're actually using EB2Go DLL and against a local database file. Again, a little bit of hassle if you really want to deploy EB2Go. So my suggestion is actually to just rename the DLL and go for the simpler and more obvious approach. An alternative to using dbExpress, and certainly an interesting alternative if you are specifically using InterBase, is to use the IBX component. In this set of components, there is only one thing you basically have to do, which is change the server type. The server type lets you pick either the full-blown server or the embedded version of InterBase. Again, if you pick it at design time and make it sure it can load the proper DLL because it's on the path, you get it tied to the IDE. So you really don't want to set the server type at design time. You want to get the server type set at runtime. So here I've created another standard application with a grid, a data source, and an open button. There's still no code in here. What we can do is go to the InterBase section and go for an InterBase database component and pick dataset for it. And also we'll need a transaction. So we'll hook the transaction to the database. We'll hook the dataset to the database. We'll hook the data source to the dataset. And now we still have to go for some configuration. As you can see here, there is this server type option, which is either server or embedded. If you try to set embedded, since InterBase ToGo is not on the path, on the system path, we get an error. So for now, we can leave it to server. We're going to change it before deploying the application. We have our dataset. Well, for now, let's simply add the select statement manually. Select star from employee. We need to set the database name. Again, we're going to target the local folder. We need to disable the login prompt and enter the standard parameters. And now we can write the code for the open button. We can switch to the embedded server, turn on the connection, and open the dataset. That's enough to get us running with this very simple IBX application. Again, an application we can deploy along with the EB2Go DLL file. And in this case, we don't need the Midas DLL or the dbExpress driver DLL. So it's even simpler deployment model. Now there are a few things you have to do to make this InterBase Express application work properly, including reading and writing data and the ability to cache information or not cache information, but perform the full operation. For that, what we have to do is to use some of the features that are tied to the component, including the ability to change the various strings for reading and writing and updating the database and so on. There are actually multiple SQL strings. Now, this can be done only if you are connected with a developer database at design time, and then you deploy against the ToGo version at runtime. This is what I've already prepared in a different demo. This application is similar to the previous one. It has the database, the transaction. In this time, I have a full-blown version of the database table, and I'm connected to the server. I can connect at design time. I have to remember to disconnect. I can connect at design time, and this lets me fully configure the update code. I can pick the primary keys and generate the SQL, and then get to see the SQL for the modify, insert, delete, and refresh statements, again with the specific key that I picked. You can easily customize the way this code gets generated in a very simple and flexible way, but you need to have metadata, so you need the connection to the DB available at design time. Okay, now remember to disconnect from the DB, and now as the program starts, I do something similar. I change the server type, the database name, and I reconnect to the DB, and I get this scenario. Now, what I can do is to do full editing of my data. So I can change the name of a person. It is not using cached updates, so every single change we do is sent back immediately to the database. Of course, you can configure it differently with the cached updates. So if you now run it, we should have our data modified to Peter without the double R. The other thing I've added to this application is I've connected the generator field for a given field, the employee number. So whenever I create a new record on the client side, what happens is that I get a new unique ID. This is the error I mentioned earlier. If you leave the database connected at design time, you cannot change the connection at runtime. Now that this is fixed, hopefully, we can run it again against db2go. We get here, we create a new record, and we get a new ID for our employee. We pick a department, we pick a name, date, and everything else, and I don't even want to go through this, but we get the new record with the unique ID based on the generator. And if we skip it, we get what's called a hole, so we get another unique ID. That's the following value, but that's generally not a significant issue in terms of database development. So IBXpress has nice features of in terms of InterBase integration. For example, simplify way to manage your SQL statements and direct support for generators, plus very good support for multiple transactions and other related features. You can, of course, implement similar features also for dbExpress. You can do editing and caching with the client dataset. You can either do full caching or directly write the updates to the DB with the on after post event handler of the database. So as soon as you post locally, the data is also sent to the DB by calling apply updates. If you want to use generators, you have to hook them up manually. You're writing something very similar. So on after insert, you go fetch a new value and save it from the by running the generator directly, generator query, and save it locally. Let me show you this in one of these demos. It's actually a demo we have already looked to. This had a SQL dataset, provider and client dataset, and the client dataset has event handler. So after delete and after post, it does do update, and it applies the updates to the client dataset directly. The other feature of this program, as I mentioned, is the ability to get a log and to see the complete communication that goes back and forth to the DB, including all of the metadata operations. Again, these are exactly identical using the full-blown version of the server or using the DB ToGo version. And you can, even if there is no formal connection to the DB, you can still get a log of the information that goes back and forth using the SQL monitor. Now let me move to the final part, which is actually a key part of this session, which is the deployment to the Mac. Now we have built a VCL application, which is good for Windows, but what we can also do using Delphi XE2 is to create a FireMonkey application. This FireMonkey application we will be able to run both on Windows and on the Mac using the same exact source code, and by deploying the specific version of InterBase ToGo to the Windows deployment or to the Mac deployment. There is basically nothing but a couple of very minor issues, including the relative file locations that you have to handle to do the full Mac deployment. Now, there are differences in the application architecture. For example, we don't have a DB grid in FireMonkey, so we have to resort using live bindings, which is actually not terribly difficult to use. Is for the default settings is just a couple of mouse clicks away. We can still pick either dbExpress or InterBase Express. Both options are available and both work without too much trouble on Mac. So that's what I'm going to showcase in the last part of the talk. But given this is slightly more complex demo, I will actually start with an existing application that uses dbExpress. This is the dbExpress application written in FireMonkey. We still have a connection component with the same configuration we used before and the same extra driver configuration. We have an SQL dataset, provider, client dataset, data source, but the connection to the grid is different. We need to use live binding, so I've added a bind scope DB component to this application, and the string grid is connected, if we look at the live bindings property, with a DB link string grid to the actual bind scope. So the connection is between the bind scope and the string grid. This is how we are hooking the two, and in terms of binding configuration, Again, we have a linking from the grid control to the bind scope DB. I haven't customized the columns, could have done it, but this is not a session on live bindings, it's a session on using InterBase ToGo in our Windows and Mac applications. There is a navigator component here, again tied to the bind scope. There is an apply updates button, and there is a button for opening the connection. Again, there is the same code we've seen before for hooking into the customized driver. There is some code I'll mention in a second, and then simply open the connection and the DB. So if we run this application, we can open it. We hook to this specific database, and this is the application itself. Again, we can go edit some of our data and apply the updates to the given database table. Now, the next step is actually to add a platform, something I've already done, add the Mac platform as a target, configure, enable the platform, configure your profile. What you have to do is you need to have a Mac, physical Mac, and I'm connected over the network to a Mac Mini, technically, that's the name, and sitting on a given IP address, and I can test the connection and make sure my Mac can receive my application and let me do full debugging. Next thing you can do is to go to the deployment page of your application and pick the various files that you want to deploy. You might want to deploy some of the features like the Midas library, the dbExpress InterBase driver. Of course, there is no ready-to-use option to deploy either the employee GDB database or the dynamic link library. This is not relevant. We could deploy it this way, or would be difficult to deploy all of the InterBase folder and the settings and the licenses. So the alternative option is to deploy a partial application and then add to the package the extra files that we need. So if I don't do a run, but I just do a deploy, what happens is that the application is copied over, and I'm going to create a new app on my Mac. So let's move to the Mac. On the Mac, I have the Platform Assistant server installed. This has a scratch-tier folder, which is where all of the various applications get deployed. And the specific one we're going to look for is dbEmployee. If we go to show the package contents, you can see that under the Mac OS folder where the application and the symbol files are saved, I've also deployed the IB2Go dynamic link library, the database itself, and the InterBase folder with the licensing information under it. With this structure, if I now redeploy the application on top of it, the application will start, and I don't have InterBase on this Mac. I only have the ToGo version. I can do an open and get my data from the local employee GDB file up and running. And again, this is the previous version of the data that I deployed. I can do apply and change my information. This is because we have the custom driver name with the driver settings. If we skip it, if we don't have that information, we have to rename our file quite simply get here and rename libEb2go dylib into libgds.dylib. If you do a local deployment, it doesn't need to be on the load path, on the system path, or anything like that. You just have to deploy the local file. Now, the second problem is how we refer to the employee GDB file. There is a difference in Delphi XE2 between how Windows and Mac load a local file, a file from the local folder. If you don't use an absolute path, but use a relative path, depending on the operations, but for some of the operations, what happens is that it uses an absolute folder. So if we look on the Mac, the information returned by get current directory, we don't get the current folder, but the root folder for the user. So if we want to hit the folder of the executable, what we can do is use the executable folder, extract file path of prime string of 0, and use it in front of the database name to change the database. So the database won't have a relative path, it will have an absolute path. So that's the idea, and that's the way you have to use if you want to be able to actually run the package as a standalone package and be able to open and get the information. Otherwise, you get the proper folder structure, again using the local folder. You get the proper folder structure and you can open it in debugging, but you cannot, you have a different current folder if you run it from the app package directly. So we have seen how we can use dbExpress for a Mac application. We can build and test on Windows, manage our deployment in the deployment manager, or just add further files to the package on the Mac directly. Can rename the dynamic link library or reconfigure the driver. Probably again, the first way is the simplest way to go. Similarly, we can deploy our IBX application to the Mac as soon as we move the user interface from VCL to FireMonkey. This is an application that uses the EB database. Again, standard one. We're going to change at runtime, and we're going to change from server to embedded. We have transaction, we have dataset with generator and basically the same settings of the previous demo, data source, bind scope DB, and binding list with the binding to the string read. If you are interested in more information about live bindings, there is a white paper written by my friend Kerry Jensen that I really recommend you to go through. Here we don't have time to really delve into that topic. So let me run this application on Windows first. We can open the local DB using InterBase ToGo, again simply by setting it to the embedded, changing the database name to the local file, and connecting. Similarly, we can add the Mac OS target. Now, if we run this application, we get into a problem because even if we change the server type to embedded, it is initially server, so as the component is loaded, even if the database is not connected, it will still try to load the proper DLL, the GDS, libgds dylib. So one way to fix the problem is to edit the DFM file and go for embedded, save, and run the application, and we should be able to have the program running properly. However, I really consider this impractical. It works. I consider it impractical because the problem is that as soon as we open our form at design time, we get an error and we get the information reset. I think it's a better option rather than trying to kind of fight against this behavior, simply as I've done here, to go into the package and rename the IB2Go dynamic link library as libgds. Go to the source code, and without any change, even if by default we have the server type set to IB server, we can run the application, deploy it to the Mac, and have it up and running without any significant problem. So again, there are ways to work with the customized version of the driver, but in most cases, you want just to rename the DLL. Finally, there is a set of components that are specifically meant for server management. You can get server information, manage backup, and restore operations. Of course, you can also use IB console. You can also use the command line. The db2go comes with a full set of command line utilities for the core management. But in terms of a Delphi application, it's actually nicer to be able to use direct visual components to configure without having to run as a local script, which is different on different platforms. In terms of server configuration, one specific feature that is worth mentioning is encryption. You can encrypt the database at the table or column level. Out of this last area, what I want to show you is demo of the code you need to do to manage backups. I have added an InterBase backup service component to the application. And what it does, it grabs the settings from the database component. So it gets the server type, the database name. You can get a list of backup files. So I'm clearing the list and adding just one. It's not a very powerful strategy, also because I don't call randomize, so I always get the same sequence. But anyway, just provide a name for your backup file. And then you have to write this simple sequence, attach the backup service, start the service, and wait until it's done, and then detach the service. This code works on the Mac, and I already have the Mac application running here. Every time you hit backup, and of course you don't want the user to hit backup, but to do it behind the scenes, you get a backup file with the database data. Again, every time you click it, you get a backup file, and same identical source code we can also run on Windows. Run our application, open the database connection, and create backups. And now if we go actual folder, we get the various backup files. Again, sorry for not having gone too much in depth into the server management, but there was quite a few things to cover in terms of getting applications running with InterBase ToGo on Windows and on the Mac, using PCL on Windows and using FireMonkey on Windows and on the Mac. We saw how to configure InterBase Express and also how to work with dbExpress. Renaming the DLL or dylib or dynamic link library actually helps, but also how we can work around it if you really want to deploy the InterBase ToGo file with its specific DLL name.